This is Larry Zbyszko, wrestling's living legend, and you're watching Monty and the Pharaoh.
If you're injured, is to grow up and be a man. Come on.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Long Island's #1 pro wrestling broadcast, Monty and the Pharaoh. Just got done with Stan Hansen. It's been a whirlwind, right? From Tito Santana last Saturday to Coco Beware Thursday. Friday was Lanny Poffo. We just got done with Hall of Famer Stan Hansen. And guess what? Sitting in the hot seat right now is none other than superstar manager JJ DIllon. JJ, thank you to the show. Welcome.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Real quick, 350 Days dropped Tuesday. That's Evan Ginsberg, who has a show on Village Connection Radio and Rockstar Studios from 11 to 1 p.m. And JJ, you do a cameo at the end when it was in theaters with Mr. Ginsberg. You got any thoughts on 350 Days?
Well, it's been a while since it was recorded, but they came to my home, and so I got a chance to see a lot of my personal memorabilia and things that meant something to me for my career, and really go to a level that I don't usually do with interviews, and really enjoyed it.
Well, we enjoyed watching you. You're always informative. To my right is none other than the star of the show, Mr. DIllon. This is superstar Jimmy Pharaoh, who's a hero in his own right.
Oh, well, enough about myself. Let's talk about you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Should I give him the esteemed introduction?
Sure, why not?
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce our esteemed guest, JJ DIllon, extensive wrestling career. By the way, for those of you who are not aware, not just a manager, many years as a wrestler, winning many championships in many areas of the country. Mike, I don't know if you knew this, but it says here that on April 23rd, 1984, he actually challenged Tito Santana for the Intercontinental title.
I missed that.
I think that was at MSG. If I'm not mistaken. Of course, most remembered as a manager in pro wrestling, guided many wrestlers to single and tag titles in the NWA, achieved his greatest success as the manager of the Four Horsemen, which of course consisted of the Nature Boy Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, later on Lex Luger, Barry Windham. And then, of course, he served as an executive.
Wait, you forgot about Paul. You forgot about Paul Roma.
Yeah, I did, didn't I? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that, or did I? I might have.
Well, that's
I'm rough.
Ouch.
What can I say? Yeah. There's someone waiting to give me an elbow the next time we book. Of course, he went on to work in Vince's front office for many years. I believe from around '89 to '97 or so. Returns to WCW, not just in the office, but as an on-air commissioner, which I remember well, lasting to the fall of 1998. Went on a little bit after that to do some work, with the TNAs of the world and stuff like that. But most importantly, let's get some personal information. Born with the greatest name ever, being a huge Doors fan, this man is Jim Morrison.
Yeah, we're just talking about that.
Yeah. What do you mean you're changing your name? Jim Morrison? But it all worked out. It was perfect. Ring names during his wrestling career: JJ DIllon, James J. DIllon, JoJo DIllon. Interesting. 6 feet tall, billed at 238, trained by the great Eddie Graham. Okay. Debut in 1968 for those who are curious, and retired 2003. As far as championships, there's plenty. Championship wrestling from Florida, former heavyweight champion of Florida, which we grew up watching on UHF.
New York.
Yep, of course. Tag team championship with Roger Kirby, Florida television champion, NWA international heavyweight champion, Western States champion also on TV, Georgia Championship Wrestling, Macon Heavyweight Championship, Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame 2013, PWI Manager of the Year, not once, not twice, 3 times, 82, 83, and 88. And, of course, most importantly, WWE Hall of Fame Class 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, the manager of the Four Horsemen, the great JJ DIllon.
And he is great. Thank you,
I
JJ.
want to correct you, but I
please
shy
do.
away from the manager of it. I always call myself the leader of the Four.
The leader. There you go.
I'm distinguished from not being just a
Right.
quote-unquote manager.
Right.
Oh, that's fair.
Makes sense to me.
Go ahead, Jim. We got.
Well, after I get done going through all of the very long resume, how about why wrestling? How do we start with pro wrestling?
I was a fan, 16-year-old kid living in New Jersey, and back in those days, this is before cable television, but born and raised in Trenton, we would get TV from Philadelphia that was like 40 miles away, and then New York was like 60, 65 miles away. So located to get good programming from both major centers, and then wrestling at that point was only on 1 day a week from the Capitol Arena in Washington, D.C. with Ray Morgan for an hour and a half every Thursday, and that was where I was introduced to wrestling. But I used to go to the live events too.
How old were you when you first caught it on TV?
Wow, I don't know. I started watching when I was about 16. I had a fan club for Johnny Valentine.
Okay.
And something about him, at that point, I didn't really understand why, but I even at that point, early on, realized that there was something special about him. And he didn't wear the fancy jackets. He wasn't flamboyant on interviews. He would get more by climbing the ring steps and people reacting, and him just doing that he would stare at people, eye contact. It just was something about him that it's called that it factor. And you ask me, well, how do you define it? I can't define it. It's either guys have it or they don't, and he had it for sure.
Was there anyone else during those early days besides him that you gravitated to?
Trying to think back, that whole era was just the depth of talent was so good. I mean, I go back to Rocca and Perez and Carl Von Hess, Chief Big Heart, Haystacks Calhoun, and these were bigger than life characters. Haystacks Calhoun with the coveralls and the horseshoe around his neck, Chief Big Heart with the full headdress, Indian headdress, and it's one thing to see cartoons, but this was like another dimension where here are these guys that you would see on TV that you could go into a live arena and see. And the first time I went to a live event was at the Armory in Trenton, New Jersey, and I was hooked that first day. Just an atmosphere that I can't describe.
Thoughts on Gorgeous George?
Well, he was the pioneer for it all. He knew that, and he was a quality wrestler as a wrestler, but he realized that to set himself apart from everyone else, he needed to do something else. And so the hair and the Georgie pins and the ballet, it opened a whole new realm that wrestling just exploded from there, and a lot of people followed him.
Fair to say that he was the template for guys like Superstar Graham, later on the Hogans and stuff. Is he basically the E in entertainment that Vince loves to show today?
I would say so. He's the one that pioneered it all.
Your memories of Eddie Graham?
Eddie Graham is probably the greatest person that had influence on my life. And I remember back in those days with Madison Square Garden, which I would go from Trenton to the Garden, and seeing Dr. Jerry and Eddie Graham. And what was so eye-opening to me was that Dr. Jerry was the front runner. He was the flamboyant one. He's the one that did all the talking. And then Eddie silently stood by his side, half a step behind him, and really wasn't he wasn't a focal point of the team, other than mechanically in the ring. He was the one that Dr. Jerry was the flamboyant one, but Eddie was the foundation of the whole thing. And then as I got closer and closer on the inside of the business, pretty soon understood that Eddie was somebody who was universally respected as probably the most I would say the most knowledgeable person of the psychology of the profession. He just was a genius.
Did you
He
find
had about a 7th grade education, but he was a genius.
Did you find training difficult as you were breaking in?
No, and I actually never was really formally trained by him. When they say Eddie Graham trained me, but I in New Jersey back when I was in high school, they had no amateur wrestling. I don't know if somebody had gotten hurt and the state just
really
didn't have amateur wrestling.
That's strange. Okay.
So I never saw a amateur wrestling match until I went to college. I went to Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I had befriended one guy in particular who was very kind to me. Was the original Zebra Kid, George Bolus, and he traveled internationally, and it was like I used to go Wednesday. They would have a live studio show in Philadelphia, and I was a young kid, and remember George Bolus with the mask on came out of the front door of the studio on Walnut Street, and I wasn't being a smart aleck, but Mr. Bolus, nice to see you, and he never even flinched, never even glanced, just almost like he didn't even hear me, but I know he did. And there was right across the street, and there was a one-way street going to my left, and there was like a down ramp, and that's where the guys would park, and they would exit on the other street over, and it was one way the opposite way. And I knew that. So he didn't acknowledge me with the mask on when he went by. As soon as he started down the ramp, I ran around the block to the other side, and I'm standing there, with my arms crossed real smug. And when he pulled up the ramp, didn't have the mask on, and he couldn't just pull out because there was traffic. He had to wait till there was an opening of traffic, and conveniently had his window down. Oh, Mr. Bowles, nice to see you again. And he kind of looked at me then and nodded, and it was the beginning of a friendship with him.
Wow.
Your memories of actually capturing Florida heavyweight title gold.
Oh, that was a big deal for me because Florida wrestling is a term that is defined in many ways, a lot of times by where you live and the product. And what Florida was with Eddie Graham, with Hiro Matsuda, and the Briscoes was founded on the better amateurs. And yet if you went to Tennessee, it was wild, and it was all called professional wrestling, but it was like day and night in terms of the product. And if you went up to Detroit where the Sheik was, it would be more of the same.
So the territories were distinctively different from each other, depending on where you were.
This is before cable television, before the internet. So every territory produced their own television show. So whatever they put on television, that audience, that's what they perceived wrestling to be. And it was different for the Sheik with his wild style up in Michigan, as opposed to Eddie Graham in Florida, that was more based on amateur credentials.
So you went to college. Did you graduate?
Yes.
What'd you end up graduating?
I have a degree in sociology and a minor in history, both of which I don't think I ever put to practice. But.
So you enter the territories in wrestling. I mean, what were the paydays like? And what point are you like, God, I'm a college graduate. What am I doing right now?
Well, I never really thought about that. It was my parents knew that I loved wrestling, and the only thing that they asked was that I follow through and go to college and get my degree. So I did it with the idea in mind, not a career-based thing where I had a degree in sociology and a minor in history, which I could have been a social worker, but my goal was to do what George Bolus had said. He told me, get your college degree, because this business is a physical business. There are risks. You could come into the business, something happen, go wrong, and your career is over. And if you have that college diploma in your back pocket, you always have that to fall back on. You can never take that away from you. And that was excellent advice that I pass on to others today, that wrestling will always be here. So get your education first. Have that, because that's important. And if you never have to use it, okay, but it's there for you.
How did we go from Jim Morrison to JJ DIllon? How did we come up with that?
Wow, I wrestled as Jim Dilllon, and in I want to say around 1975, I had I had been in the Carolinas, which is where I started, and then I went to the Canadian Maritimes, where I got my chance to basically be a villain, be a heel, and I met Archie Goldie, the Stomper, up there, and it was a seasonal territory that they would run the hockey arenas in the summer when the ice wasn't down, and then I went from there to Florida. Well, I went briefly to Amarillo to go to Japan, and then to Florida. But I met up with. I got a call one day. Archie Goldie was in Florida, and he was leaving Florida to go to Tennessee with Bearcat Wright as his manager, and I had been around enough to know that Archie Goldie, the Mongolian Stomper, and Bearcat Wright was like oil and water. It was destined to not be a long-term relationship. So they left Florida and joined up, went to Tennessee, and that didn't work well. And so Archie went back to Florida and started doing his own interviews again, and so I got a call from him one day, and he said, I gotta get out of here, and I've got a chance to go to Dallas. Red Bastien was the booker for Fritz von Erich in Dallas, and he said, they've promised me a main event spot, but he said, I need a manager. And have you ever given any thought to managing? I said, no. And he said, well, I was in the Maritimes. Your interviews, not taken away from your in-ring performance, but it's obviously you weren't a gym rat. You didn't have that typical, wrestler physique. That your strongest point were your interviews. And he said, I realized that, and he said, now I have a chance to leave here and go to Dallas, where Red Bastien's booking. It'll be a main event spot, but I have to have a manager. And he said, have you ever given any thought to it? I said, no, but I realized that my strongest suit, I could perform, which was good as a manager. If you ever then had to be forced into the ring, I had that ability too. And so that's how it started. I went to Dallas, and the Mongolian Stomper, managed by Jim Dilllon, I remember Red Bastien saying that doesn't roll off your tongue. It's something missing. So you need to formalize it. If you're, because I went out and bought a bunch of leisure suits and changed my image, and he said, the Mongolian Stomper by Jim Dilllon it doesn't roll off your tongue. So he said, what if we did James Dillon? I said, sure, that's fine. And then if you're going to be somebody that's businesslike and dressed in a suit, you should have a middle initial. So James J. I said, okay, my middle name is Albert. James A. James JJ.
James Albert.
Yeah, JJ rolls off your tongue better.
Yeah,
and so that's how Red Bastien gave me the name.
That's great.
Yeah.
Was there any internal wrestling within yourself, giving up the dream of being a wrestler and becoming a leader? I want to stick with the leader thing. Switching over to managerial situation. Was that easy for you? Did you contemplate that? Did you notice that, hey, this is changing. It looks like they may want me to be a manager. I mean, was that hard for you to put the wrestling in the rearview mirror? Obviously.
Well, I kind of think I looked at it the other way. That
okay.
As a manager, I could concentrate on my strongest points, which were my interviews. And then if I was forced to go in the ring, I would have my ability where I could early part of my career to fall back on.
Right.
And the smartest thing was I learned early on and Bobby Heenan reinforced this to me, is there's a skill to wrestling like a manager. That I had the ability because I had held major titles, but the fans look at you as a manager, and you somehow go in the ring as a polished wrestler. Somehow the logic in their eyes falls down. So I then had to learn how to wrestle like a manager.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your career's turning towards management. At some point, are you looking at other famous managers like a Lou Albano, Grand Wizard, Bobby Heenan, or
for influence, for things to tips to pick up? Do you have any personal managers that you studied, or maybe even admired?
I studied them. I admired them all and studied them all.
Oh,
they
that's
were
good.
Some of the greatest, and I had rubbed elbows with all of them. So I thought and I think even as a wrestler, you have to develop your own character, your own style. And if you break it down, it's like you see a guy who does something and maybe he does a move and you think, that's a move that I could do. Now, I'm not going to replicate his style. I don't want to be that person under another name like I stole his identity, but I could take one little piece of what he does that I do well. I take another little piece over here from what this person does, and pretty soon I put it all together, and now I have this original persona that I fit very comfortably into.
Who do you feel, and I know it's pinning you a little bit, but who do you feel would you say is the greatest manager of all time? Who's the Hulk Hogan or the Bruno of managers? Who's the one?
I think when you look back over the early days, Bobby Davis had the impact with me. He managed Buddy Rogers and Bob Orton, and he was a tall, skinny kid, and he had the Elvis Presley ducktail haircut in the back, and he just was the kind of guy who had a swagger about him. But as a fan, you think, I'd like to grab that guy and just
kill him.
Slap the paint off his face.
Yeah. Like when we used to watch you, we could wait for you to get your ass kicked. JJ, was the ultimate goal as being a wrestler to reach the WWE, or was it different back then? Was the NWA the big thing to hit, or was it the AWA? Or, everything's WWE now, right? Because they're the ultimate winner. So, a lot of wrestlers spin it, the ultimate goal was to get to New York. And when you were in New York, that was it. You've reached the pinnacle of your career.
Was this true then?
I had in my mind three, I have a bucket list with three criteria that I felt in my mind that I had to meet before I could say, hey, I made it in the business. And the three things were, back in those days, all of the top stars went to Japan. So to tour Japan was a necessity on my bucket list. Australia was hot then, back when Barnett and Doyle had Australia. So all of the top stars toured Australia. And the third one was at actually Madison Square Garden. So I thought, before I can, in my own mind, say, okay, you have finally made it, was when I could say that I wrestled in Australia, which I lived there and wrestled for a year, and worked New Zealand too, where I went to Japan and I ended up making like 16 tours as a wrestler for as long as 6 weeks. And then eventually when I went to Madison Square Garden and I walked in the ring and said, okay, I came here as a kid from Trenton and admired the Grahams and all the great stars, and now I'm entering the ring, so I can, in my own mind, say, okay, you have made it.
On a wrestling level, just on a wrestling level, in-ring level, I wanted to get your take on, do you think that the NWA during the territory days, on a wrestling level, was giving a better product than what Vince's company was offering?
Well, it was, I don't know if you could say better is a different product, because wrestling has many definitions in terms of, like, if you go to Florida, like back in those days when Eddie Graham was in Florida with Hiro Matsuda and the Briscoes, everything was, they followed the Briscoes coming out of Oklahoma, and that was a big deal, and Hiro Matsuda reinforced it with Japan, and it was a credential, what's your legitimate background based thing. Bob Roop was another example.
That's if your strong point was amateur wrestling, you were a wrestler. If your strong point, well.
And Eddie Graham used to say, I don't tell you what to do with your personal life, but he said, I'll just, it's known fact that if you, on Tuesday nights after Tampa, if you want to go to the Imperial Lounge and buy a few, and you might run into a fan that if you ever get challenged and lose,
you're out. I love it.
Yes, you pack your bag and you don't have a job here anymore.
That's
so
great.
there was always in the back of my mind that I was not I had wrestled as an amateur and I could handle myself, but I certainly wasn't a tough guy. So I never put myself in situations where I was going to get called out and embarrassed because I knew what
know your role.
Know my role. Yes.
So, wrestling. What makes a great wrestler? Mic skills, mat skills. Which is more important?
I think both are important, and in different eras.
One may have been more important than the other.
One may have been more important than the other, and I never could get myself to say, okay, you need to invest in, go to the gym and look more like a bodybuilder, and I hate it. I never went to a gym in my life.
Didn't even say your prayers and take your vitamins?
Well, I might have done that, but I was tall, lean, and because I was tall, my appearance in the ring was that I actually looked bigger than I was if I was physically standing next to you. So that was my advantage. And then I just wanted to hone my skills, and in a great example, I went to Amarillo, and here's Dick Murdoch, who's I'm like 6 foot, maybe it's just a stretch over 6 foot, and here's Murdoch that's 6'2", 6'4", maybe 230 soaking wet. Murdoch is 260, 270 in there.
Wow.
And just a big raw bone dude.
Yeah, big dude.
And
I loved him. He was
because
great.
of my and I was like the kid from New York with a silver spoon in his mouth, and I talked down to the people, and I wasn't a yeller screamer.
No.
I got my heat in a different way.
You sure did.
And Murdoch made me by him selling. Dickie loved doing it. He would.
It's okay.
Sorry about that.
He'll call you back. He's doing a show.
It always happens.
Yeah, that's my daughter. I don't know where she is.
Oh, okay.
She's coming in from. She's been over in Europe for a couple of months. I'm picking her up Monday.
Excellent. Hopefully there's no rain like today.
Oh yeah, I hope for the good of WrestleMania that the weather clears and the temperature goes up.
I don't think it is. I think this is going to be a
44
rough
degrees.
one,
I heard
man.
44 degrees with showers.
This is why major events don't happen in New York. Super Bowls,
It's true.
even the
Weather
World
stinks.
Series at this point. The
It's a
weather
risk.
changes.
It's
It's not worth the risk. Let's put it that way.
You need to go. They should have scheduled at the end of this month, not the beginning. And that 30 days is. Oh, here's somebody. Hold on. Hello.
JJ DIllon taking a call from his daughter right on a live
doing a live
interview.
This is fantastic.
You can't beat this on
cannot
Monty the
beat
Pharaoh.
on the air.
This is great.
This is
And the phone
incredible.
rang and I picked it up.
Yeah.
No.
love it.
Wait, no. I will call you when I'm done.
It's awesome.
Where are you?
It's classic.
It's awesome.
Where are you?
Yeah, where are you?
You're in Bangkok.
Oh,
Okay,
holy
I'm
cow.
talking to my
Kinda
daughter.
jealous.
My daughter Amanda,
Kinda
who's
jealous.
named Missy, and she's in Bangkok, Thailand.
Hello.
And she's coming back Monday. The crew here says hello.
Hello.
And I look forward to seeing you Monday. I missed you. I love you. Bye, Pooh.
Awesome.
That was awesome.
So
See a little realism here on Monty the Pharaoh.
You certainly did a great job as being a heel manager. I will tell you personally, I can speak for the Pharaoh, we hated your guts.
Oh, but that's what he was supposed to be doing.
So let's jump into what you're most famously known
I kinda
for.
like them,
the Four Horsemen. How do you get involved with this crew? And then then we're about to hit you with some questions.
And did you know it was going to take off?
No, is the answer to that.
Where does it all
Because
begin?
like most really big successful things in this business are not somebody's creative idea and say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to name this, they're going to do that.
Organic more?
It's
More organic?
Yes, it's a spontaneous,
Beautiful.
organic thing. And because the ultimate judge and jury is always the audience, the people. And they either buy into what you're doing or they don't.
Unless it's today's WWE where they don't care what you think because they're the only game in town.
Yeah, but from a different era, it just was. It was different. I don't know how
You
else.
deserve it. If I hear that one more time,
Yeah.
I'm out of my mind over this. So how does it all come together, though, the Four Horsemen? Had first approach to you about the
It just
idea?
was something that
How do the four and you?
we were. It was four guys who already were at the top of their game individually. So it wasn't like a lot of times a group will bring somebody in that's. The closest was when Luger came in. He came out of Florida. He didn't have the big credentials at that point, and he got the rub from us that kind of fast-tracked him. But at that point with the Horsemen, it was like 4 guys who already were at the top of their game that just legitimately enjoyed each other's company.
Does Flair come to you with the idea? Who comes
Nobody
to
came to us with an
It
idea.
just happened?
And Rick was
It's amazing.
Rick was at the top of his game. And there are a lot of people who were at his level that wouldn't want a rub with other people. They don't, in other words,
Interesting.
like, well,
True.
I don't want you capitalizing on what I worked so hard to get here for. We were just guys that legitimately enjoyed each other's company. And we could do an interview with the 4 of us, and somebody would get on a roll. And that guy would go, and the rest of us, you know, we wouldn't be looking at this. We would be listening intently, and, you know, our body language, we're listening to that interview too. And even if we didn't say anything, and if a guy got on a roll and he was the only one that spoke, when it was over, there were no long faces or I know.
So no jealousy involved.
My mic time, no, absolutely none.
You started with
Awesome.
Tully though. You were Tully's manager, right? Tully Blanchard. Was he a partier back then? Were you involved in that? Did you tell him to try to calm down if he was? What was the deal with him?
Tully was his own thing. Tully came from a wrestling family. His father, Joe, was a football player in Canada that wrestled in Canada. And so Tully was around wrestling since he was as far back as he can ever remember. And Tully was just a natural.
You think he's underrated a little bit? Because I do.
Oh, definitely.
I
Yeah.
think he
'Cause
really
he didn't
is.
have the big.
No, he wasn't
Body.
he didn't seem like a big guy.
Yeah, but you look back on his promos, that guy was fantastic.
Yep, and what he did too, and he used to like, he used to give me the egg every now and then, because I wrestled. They didn't have wrestling in high school when I went to high school in New Jersey, so I played judo for 3 years.
It's really strange.
So
too.
I learned break falls, and that was instilled in me that as a professional wrestler, I would take clean bumps until he'd roll his eyes at me and, you know, James, that was so perfect. And Tully was a stumble, fumble, fall that if you're comparing the two, he definitely looked more legitimate. He would like not fall so cleanly like I would. But it worked for us to all be together. And we, like I say, the Horsemen were guys who were already at the top of their own game. So it wasn't like, until like Luger came along, he got sideways with.
Did Luger ruin that
difficult
chemistry?
to work with?
No, but it was like he was in Florida, and he got crossways with Brody, I think, and had to leave. Climbed out of a cage match.
Had to leave.
And then when he climbed out of the cage match, I remember Eddie Graham called Jimmy
hilarious.
Crockett, and he said, "I have a guy down here who is basically, you know, he's inexperienced, but he has an unbelievable body.
He looks like Thor.
Yeah, and but you
One
have to
thing
know
going
that
for him.
that's what you're getting." And so Jimmy said, "Okay, I could put him with these guys, and you know they can bring him along slowly, and there won't be any pressure on him."
Well, the storyline with that is great, but
Yeah.
you hear about Luger that he was embarrassed to be a pro wrestler at some points. Did you get that from him?
Yeah, probably a little bit of that. He never expressed it in that way, but there was like a level of discomfort initially that he wasn't like everybody else. He was happy to be there, and
Did you think he
never
was
gave
better
his
than
attitude.
everybody?
Do you
Go ahead,
think- do
JJ,
you-
say it. It's
no,
fine.
seriously, do you think he worked hard enough to improve on his craft? Because he was so lacking.
Well, I
in-
guess getting to the point though, I don't think he really believed in the craft, and he was stuck in a situation. I think, and he wasn't
as bad
happy
as
being
Warrior,
there.
was he, with his attitude towards the sport? Or
No, I'm not. Definitely not.
okay.
And Lex I got along with him and consider him a friend to this day. When I see him, you know, he's in a wheelchair, but he always has a hug
Is he
for
now?
me. And, yeah.
He is now. Oh God.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you your thoughts on Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. Is he the greatest of all time? Is he the ultimate package between promo and in-ring performance? Do you think he's
To
the
me,
greatest?
He is. I mean, you go back at the history of the title, you look at Thez that had it for like 25 years, and he was the epitome of what a champion should be. But everything evolves, and when Rick came, he was a different style champion than Thez was. He was more flamboyant, started in the Carolinas, but he could adapt to wherever he went without completely changing his core. And to me, I could back the argument that Thez was the greatest champion of all time, and then if you told me, well, I think Flair's the greatest champion of all time, I'd say, yeah, you're right for this reason
can't
too.
argue.
Is it fair to make a WWE parallel Bruno Hogan? Very different from each other.
Yeah.
One much more in the entertainment aspect of things, the way Flair was. Flair's way better in ring. Let's not even go there as far as Flair and Hogan. It's not even close. But the extreme of the technical wrestler and then the over-the-top entertainment type, is that fair?
I think it's what the parent company had marketed their product to be to their audience. And there was a difference between, they used to talk about New York being the big guy, land of the giants, where everybody did a lot of walking and talking. The other was a southern wrestling product where it was more
down and
some
dirty.
Of the guys weren't as big, down and dirty.
Yep.
And what you did in the ring and the product was more important than your image.
So you have that Four Horsemen book, which I read. It's funny when you look at it. You have so many combination of horsemen, but it's really not that big of a time span. It's a time span, but when you just combine it, it's not a long time. You had these incredible.
14 years.
Let's get into Jim Crockett, right? You guys are rolling. I mean, you were in the heyday of NWA, WCW, whatever, Georgia Championship Wrestling. What was Crockett's problem? Did he not know how to manage that organization? Did you try to talk to him about that and say, look, you're making a mistake here?
What happened was that he got a chance to for $1 million to give Vince the TBS time slot, and then he gave him an opportunity to go national. And it was a different product, different time. And Flair was a different champion than what had ever been before. But the business is what you educate your audience to. Now, you can't slam something down their throat that they're not going to buy into.
You seen the product lately?
Well,
Sorry,
I don't wanna
had to.
go
Go.
there.
You were saying so?
but like with the Horseman thing, it was the label, the Horseman. It wasn't like somebody sat in a meeting with talent and said, well, look, why don't we put you guys together and we'll call you the Four Horsemen. How about that? What happened was that when we were doing TBS, there was like 2 hours of cable every week plus a syndicated show, and there were a lot of time slots that you weren't talking market specific. So there would be like a 2-minute spot that you'd have to fill and go all out there. And the way the Horseman thing happened was there was like, okay, here's a 2-minute spot. We don't have any talent to plug. It's generic. So you guys are all loosely connected at that point. Why don't just all of you go out there as a group? And Arn carried the load that particular interview, and as I remember back, and I don't think there's an actual recorded copy of it that we could go back and look at, but he basically said, take a look at your screen, like he was talking to whoever's sitting at home, person to person. And he said, this group right here, he said, are the absolute top of our game individually.
I just watched this.
There's
recently.
nobody better than this group.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I can't even think of what I can compare it to. He said, the only thing I think of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And he held up 4 fingers.
4 fingers.
And it was
Look what I found.
it was an impromptu
right. Wow.
I don't want to say throwaway line, but that's kind of basically what it was.
That's how wrestling is, right? I mean, it happens.
Yeah.
But I guess my point is, you guys got white hot. You have the Road Warriors. You had tons of talent. Now, again, I was a WWE guy. I watched every week, but I was totally anti NWA. Right? We were homers.
True.
But Crockett has this huge opportunity. Do you guys know he's mismanaging this? We all know the story about, Black Saturday and all that garbage and what happened there, but he had a real opportunity to do something with this, and clearly he dropped the ball.
I started my career with Jim Sr. He was alive, and I stayed there. Jim Grabmeyer was from Springfield, Ohio, and I was wrestling. I originally was going to go full time and start in Detroit. My parents lived there. I think, I got a place to stay, and the Sheik had told me, whenever you come out here, and I was going to chase my dream and be a full-time wrestler. Now I'm 28 years old. I'm not a kid. And so I moved. I was working for a trucking company, Jones Motor, in Spring City, Pennsylvania. And they had a terminal in Detroit. So I thought, I'll get them to move me, pay for my move.
Smart man.
Nice.
To Detroit.
Yeah.
And then when I get there, I'll quit the company and go to work for Sheik. Well, I get to Detroit. And I appreciate Eddie Farhat, Sheik's honesty, because he told me, he said, you're hitting here at a time where, he said, my business is a little bit soft. And he said, I have guys here now that are full-time. This is how they feed their family. And he said, if I gave you full-time employment, I would have to do it at the expense of some of their bookings. And he said, because you have a job, I would ask you to keep your job. They're moving you here. You got that as a base. I will give you as much work as I can, and then when my business turns around, I will give you the opportunity that I always promised you to bring you in full time. So I mean, how he's honest with me, and so he did. He kept me busy working just about every weekend. Plus, I knew Bruno from his days as a champion, and he had bought into the Pittsburgh territory, and so Bruno, even though Bruno and Sheik were kind of not the best of buds, Bruno didn't mind me working for Sheik, and then I was living in Niles, Ohio, which was 90 miles from Pittsburgh, and I remember calling Ace Freeman, and he didn't know who I was from Adam. Hey, what? Hey, who you? What? I said, Bruno, and I'd written to Bruno a letter and told him that I was moving out and would like to work some around Pittsburgh. And I didn't hear from Bruno, and I saw they were running a big show at the old Civic Arena, which is since tore down. So I thought, well, I'll go down and talk to Bruno. So I go down, of course, Ace Freeman comes out, and I said, I wrote Bruno a letter, but I said, I hadn't heard back from him, but I want to like to say hello to him. Yeah, okay, stay here. So he goes in, and he's in there about 2 minutes. All of a sudden, he opens the door, and his eyes are like this, and he said, let him in. So I go in the dressing room, and there's Bruno, and he gets up and comes over, gave me the biggest hug, and of course, Ace is not expecting that what I said was true. I have this relationship from refereeing all those years with so many of Bruno's title matches, and developed a friendship with him. And he looks at Ace and he said, he wants to wrestle full time. He said, I want him, and they only booked, I think it was like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3 days a week. So he said, I want him working every weekend, every day, starting this weekend if you have to add a match. And Ace is looking like, I didn't realize what he said was like how it was. And Bruno gave him his marching orders because Bruno owned the company.
Since we're back to talking about some of your in-ring stuff, I wanted to bring up and ask you your memories on the bull rope match you had with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, and your take on that's such a landmark match, and your take on Dusty in general.
Dusty was someone that I had a great relationship with, and sorely miss. My dream was to go to Florida and work for Eddie Graham. And I came back from Japan, and I called Eddie before, and he said, call me when you get back from Japan. And I landed in Calgary, and I was going to work Calgary for a week because I knew some of the Hito and Sakurada who were living there, and I always wanted to work every territory in the towns that were famous at least once. So I was there for a week, and I called Eddie, and Eddie said, and at that point he had Jody Hamilton as his booker, and he said Jody's doing a okay job. He's not going to be here forever, but he said I don't feel that I wouldn't feel good about pulling the rug from under him, but I want to be good to my word to you. So he said, call me when you get back from Japan. So when I got back from Japan, I called him, and he said, the timing is not right for you to come here, but I want you to come here when the circumstances are right. And he said, but in the meantime, I have a friend who desperately needs some help. And he said, it would be good for you to go help him because you're basically helping me, and at my word. And he said the money wouldn't be big, but it would be also a great experience for you that would eventually help you here too. And it was Bob Geigel in Kansas City.
Okay.
So I said, sure, I'll go there. So I went there and stayed there a year. And it was very, I was around Pat O'Connor, working St. Louis. It was a good experience for me. And then when I was done there, I was going to go to Florida.
What was the greatest installment of the four? Well, let's talk about Ole Anderson. Thoughts on Ole Anderson? A lot of guys come through here not big fans of Ole Anderson. Stan Hansen was. Your thoughts on Ole?
When I started in Charlotte in 1971, the Andersons were on top. It was Ole, had it been Lars, Ole, and Lars had just left and gone. So it was Ole and Gene. And so I knew Ole from day one in the Carolinas. And I made a lot of road trips with him. And he was all business. But he also was a good person to talk to understand the business and understand the territories. So that was, I had a different, I don't want to say attitude, but perceived him to be different than a lot of other people.
But how did that work then? So the first installation of the Horsemen are Arn, Ole, Flair, Blanchard. Blanchard, Flair, I don't know about Arn. Are they all three partiers? And is Ole hanging out with his family?
Yeah, Ole is kind of like it seems out of place in that group.
Yeah, it does.
He's not the party animal. But without Ole, I don't think the rest of the things would have transpired following him.
Right.
Yeah, they take off from that.
Right.
And it was the kind of thing that...
Did you have a favorite version of the Horsemen?
Well, the first... because I don't think the rest might have happened were it not for the first grouping with Ole. And in fact, when we would go to TBS, Arn on one of the interviews said, take a look at your screen. And at that point, we weren't really a formatted unit as such, but he looked at the camera and he said, take a look at your screen. He said, here are the four guys at the top of their game, the absolute best of the best. And he said, I try to find somewhere to compare. I'd have to go back in history books to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and Hell with Four Fingers. Well, we went to the town that night. I think it was Greensboro. And the whole people in the front row are yelling, Horsemen, Horsemen. And it was, that seed was planted without us even realizing, but it was something that became interactive with the people. That they could go like this, we could nod yes, go like knowledge this, and it took off. And it was a couple weeks where Jimmy Crockett said, what's this Four Horsemen thing I keep hearing about? I said, well, I'd like to think that we had this creative idea but it was just something that Arn threw out there, and every town, starting with that day when it aired, the fans are yelling, Four Horsemen, because it was an interactive thing where they felt that they were a part of it, and we could do this back and nod to them, and pretty soon the whole front row was doing this.
Were you happy with the rendition of that? How was Sid Vicious with you guys and Barry Windham? Which group was your favorite to hang out with?
We really loved when Windham was there.
Yeah, well, he was. I think I would, not disparaging anybody, but after Barry, it was because promoters will take something that is successful and they will run it like
just beat it down till
beat
it's
it
over.
down beat it down till it drops, and then
left.
they'll still trample on it for a while more because I think it's still breathing.
Right.
And so with the other guys that came along after, they said, well, Paul Romo was Horseman. Okay, I don't.
Who?
I don't begrudge people
I did it
who
again.
were at that
No, they
place.
tried. You tried to catch. They tried to catch fire. I get it.
Yeah.
Look, I just want to jump ahead real quick. You start working for Bischoff and the Goldberg Hogan era. Were you involved in those conversations with Bischoff trying to take down the WWE? Was that real? Were they all trying to destroy the WWE, and were you part of that?
How competitive was that?
I never had met Eric Bischoff prior to going there, and I called Tony Schiavone and I said I need to come there, and he said, well, and I was in the industry, somebody who was, somebody's got to pick this guy up, and it was the right place, the right time, and so I went in to meet Bischoff. Never having, I didn't even talk to him on the phone, and Tony Schiavone set the meeting up. So I go in with my first recollection is that he was Bischoff was in another room with a thing on a computer about learning to be a pilot, and he was doing simulated stuff, and he was like totally focused on that. Okay, and I don't know that I had a preconceived notion of what he was, but it wasn't. He wasn't. He supposedly had worked for Vern, but just getting coffee. And when a guy who knew Vern was in charge of, I can't think of his name, Hurd, I think, he remembered Eric Bischoff and brought him in thinking that, well, here's a TV guy that's a wrestling guy too, not realizing that no. And so that's what I walked into, and I realized that Eric was, and he had the people.
So right away, you kind of sensed.
I knew, yeah. And he had them all convinced that, oh well, he worked for Vern Gagne, came here, so here's a TV guy, because there's a TV network that owned the promotion.
Yeah, but you can do. I got to give him credit.
He did pretty good for a
building
while,
that
right?
organization.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I don't fault him.
Yeah.
Because he okay. Well,
Who can we blame for the collapse of WCW? If you have to put your finger on it, there's got to be something that was the final brick that
Paul
capsized
Roma?
the whole. Yeah, maybe him. Again?
I don't. It's like,
Was it just
my philosophy has
miscommunication
always
between
been-
Ted and Eric, and or the inmates running the asylum?
I think
What
it was
happened?
the inmates running the asylum
Yeah.
is what it was.
But
because Eric was not. They didn't get what they thought they had in Eric, and he was being
Manipulated.
not to Hall and Nash are to this day good friends of mine, and when they came in there, they realized what we got here. You know, we can pull the strings and call our own deal, and got a whole lot of money because they told him that's what it was worth, and the Turner Company had deep pockets.
Got to ask you this. I got to get this in. I want to get your take real quick. Does Cody Rhodes have a chance? You knew Dusty. You know the genetics in the family. You know he's a real wrestling guy. He's partnered up with billionaires. Does he have a chance?
Yeah, I say yes because, and part of it is I'm talking from my heart because I was so close personally with Dusty. We were opposite sides of the ring, but I could have this group over here, but no matter how hot we were, we had to have somebody of equal level on the opposite side of the ring. That's how the business works. And one feeds off the other. So at that time, I was very close personally with Dusty because I went to Florida, and it was a difficult time in Florida. Eddie brought me into book. I did not realize at that time that being a booker was more than just fresh ideas and being able to produce a good TV show. I didn't realize it then, but all the successful bookers had a crew of their guys, and when they would come into book, here comes my crew, and the crew, he knew what they were capable of doing, and they had a loyalty to the booker. So it was the promoter got a package deal, even though he just brought the one guy in, the other guys followed in, and they all had track records of doing good business. So I lost my train of thought.
So Cody's building something that you
Yes.
think can work.
So I was very close to Dusty because I worked in the office in Florida, and it was at a time when I didn't have my guys. Don Jardine was there, who was one of the great talent in the business. But if you look at the roster around then, not disparaging about Charlie Cook was there, who was a good worker, but I didn't have talent, didn't have depth, and didn't have my crew of guys that I could bring in. So I worked in Amarillo before. Eddie kind of got nervous, so he wanted to offer the book to Terry and to Dory, both of whom said, well, we don't want to move to Florida. The only way we would take the deal is if I stayed on and was seated in the office, and that they would come in and out, work with me, kind of like a team effort, but I was still to stay there. Well, Eddie wasn't going to, I had no personal problems with Eddie, and so Eddie was sure if I could get the Funks and their talent coming in and out, and that's how it started. And then Dusty finished a run in New York, and Dusty, to his dying day, probably never knew that Dusty would sometimes self-destruct in that he didn't realize where too much of Dusty is not a good thing. Eddie would manage that. He would look and he'd say, okay, it's time for Dusty to get a break. So he would then call Vince and he would say, I'd like for Dusty to come up there with you for a little bit.
I used to wonder why Dusty would appear on WWF television
so
inexplicably and then disappear.
So Vince would call Dusty and say, God, I desperately need you up here. And then Dusty would go to Eddie and he'd say, oh, well, we're really going to miss you here, but
we're really going to miss you here.
Work, and, we'll count the days till you come back. In other words, Dusty, I don't want to, to his ego, he went along with the flow.
Right.
And he didn't realize that he was being manipulated. Because he was good for wherever he went, and he also drew money and made money. So it was good for Dusty, and he thought a lot of it was his own ideas, and between Eddie and Vince, they were, okay, you take him for a while, I need him back, that kind of thing.
JJ, what was your biggest accomplishment in your career?
Surviving.
Yeah.
Surviving?
Being around
Fair
after
enough.
all of these years. Because I was never the biggest, I was never a gym rat, never the best talent-wise. I mean, I got every ounce of what talent God gave me. And a lot of it was people. I had the attitude of being grateful for what help I ever got and legitimately thankful for it. And because I'm probably one of the few people in the business that the guys who were successful wanted to help because they knew that I genuinely appreciated it and would work hard. Nobody ever worked any harder than I would with what talent I had. And it's because people wanted to help me.
What's the Mount Rushmore of managers in professional wrestling?
Ooh.
That's a good question. I've been asked that before. Playboy Gary Hart belongs up there, and he never gets the recognition because he never came to the Big Apple. Was on that stage where he would have got. But Gary Hart was
a manager in WCCW with the Von Erichs, right?
Yeah, and he was a very, very smart guy. He took Fritz's kids and made them all great stars. Gary was a genius for our business.
You got 3 to go.
I thought Mount Rushmore had 5.
They do?
4.
There you go.
What an American
What
you
do
are.
I know? Go ahead.
You are a real American.
Jim Cornette certainly has to be up there.
The racket, too? That's a lot of sculpting. All right. I can see it, though.
2 to
I can
go.
see it. 2 to go.
Yourself?
I can hear Bobby Heenan yelling at you
Bobby
right
Heenan,
now.
oh,
Okay, there we go.
absolutely.
Okay.
I'm drawing
Make this last one count, because Blassie, Albano, the Wizard...
JJ DIllon?
I don't expect him to put himself on. How about Sir Oliver Humperdinck?
They were all very good.
How about Sonny?
Sonny?
Thought I'd take a shot. Why not?
Oi.
Not bad, right?
Yeah, I am. I think to be successful in our industry, you have to have somewhat of an ego, because that's
sure.
part of it, an ingredient. But some people are overwhelmed by their own ego. I
Yeah.
just was not one of them. I
Right.
don't think I realistically,
You got one more for us? You got number 4?
Yeah.
Come on. You're almost there.
Yeah, I don't want to put my name up there. I can't think.
Well, I don't expect you to.
I probably thought of others, and I'm drawing a blank.
Maybe Albano, Wizard, Blassie.
They were all
Who else?
good.
Who else
but
from
they were-
NWA? What we got?
Paul Ellering.
Paul Ellering. Paul Ellering he was a legitimate manager.
That's what I'm saying. You were legitimate. I think Gary Hart was legitimate also, right?
Oh, my Lord.
Paul
yeah.
Ellering was legitimate. I think at some point maybe even the Grand Wizard, Ernie Roth, was legitimate.
Oh, he was awesome. Blassie was. a
Who
great
has the
manager.
biggest ego in professional wrestling? Besides Vince Jr.
I think I can't say the biggest ego because I think part of the ingredients of being successful in our business, you have to have somewhat of an ego.
Sure.
And some people, like they always used to say, well, Dusty's ego is unchecked. But Dusty had Eddie Graham, who could rein Dusty in without Dusty realizing it. He would say,
Yeah.
Dusty's he's going crazy here, and I need to get him out of here for a while. And he would call Vince Senior.
Well-
Vince Senior would call Dusty. Oh, Dusty, my territory's down.
Then you bring him right in, right?
Darn, you're instant sellout.
How well did you know Eddie Graham? Because this
Got
is
to know
leading.
him very well.
Okay, so this is leading to a question. A couple of weeks ago, we had Billy Jack Haynes in here. You know Billy Jack, right? Billy claims that Eddie was a cocaine mule with him, and they used to go to the Bahamas and transfer cocaine back and forth. Do you know
about
anything?
that? I know he had a pilot of his own plane. Plus, Lester Welch
Oh shit, this could be true then.
had his own plane.
Uh-oh.
I don't know when it comes. I don't know when it comes to Billy. I mean,
All right, we got
Eddie was Eddie, and I learned early on in the business too is to not somebody that I've never met for the first time. I don't prejudge based on what I've heard or
You've
what their
heard.
reputation.
Gotcha.
I walk in with and they have an open thing. Okay, let's see what you're all about. I want to see how you treat me, and then I'll make my judgment. And I think that's the only fair way to do it.
Fair enough. All right, so we're out of time. JJ, we want to thank you for coming in.
I've enjoyed it. Time just flew by.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you. It's
very
been
much
our
for coming.
pleasure.
Yep.
Once again, we want to thank the fans for tuning in to Monty and the Pharaoh. You can catch it on replay 24/7 here, only on the Village Connection Radio Network. This is Long Island's #1 pro wrestling broadcast. And again, at 3 o'clock, coming in is the Natural Butch Reed. So we've had a whirlwind. Again, sir, we are glad you made the choice of professional wrestling.
Oh, yeah.
You are an icon in this
yeah.
business.
Thank you.
And we thank you for coming on the show. Pharaoh?
We will see you shortly. You've been watching Monty and the Pharaoh until very short time from now. Later.
This is Larry Zbyszko, wrestling's living legend, and you're watching Monty and the Pharaoh.